Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8 of records management. We're going to try this recorded lecture in an asynchronous fashion. I hope you take some time to watch through it. I apologize for my setup here. It's far from ideal, but we all do what we have to under these circumstances. I honestly hope you're all well and that you get the chance to drop into the synchronous session that we'll be having Monday afternoon. Anyway, this week, ironically enough, we are covering issues around business continuity, disaster preparedness, and kind of the records management component that aligns with basically known as essential records. Um, uh, Essential records are sometimes called vital records, but for this description, for the sake of this discussion, let's put vital records over in one place and call those sort of the records that are held by a government entity that document some of the major life events one faces, such as birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, those kind of things, that provide some unique or explicit evidence of major life events like that. Essential records, on the other hand, are those records that a business must maintain with a goal to being able to start up after an emergency or after a disaster to ensure business continuity. Those records primarily are designed to document and protect the legal and financial rights and obligations of an organization and also the individuals impacted by it. I'm sure if you think sort of in terms of what we're facing today with the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of how various organizations are responding to this, I think we all have a very real sense of what essential records might look like. In essence, essential records are a very small proportion of an organization's records, but they're very important, one would even say essential, for the organization to have a strong sense of. Basically, it's about 3 to 5%, 3 to 7% of all records held by an organization are termed essential, and they're typically irreplaceable, and they often include such things as fixed assets, documentation of properties owned, physical plants. Also, and importantly, they document what obligations are outstanding to consumers and to the inventory chains that the organization has. Inwardly facing, they document kind of the obligations the company or organization has to its employees around issues of salaries and benefits and existing contracts. And finally, they provide documentation of the financial holdings, of the tax status, the patents, and the trademarks that might be held by an organization. These records are often far outside the typical realm of what records managers deal with, in terms of they don't typically capture the transactional nature of day-to-day business work. These are the kind of records that oftentimes records managers have to collaborate, work with, partner with senior administration in terms of identifying. So you'd be working with CEOs, CFOs, chief financial officers, CIOs, chief information officers, much more than you would with frontline staff, as a means of understanding what these records are that document these particular obligations, because oftentimes they're far outside the typical bandwidth of anyone that works in an organization. Sorry, my cat's crying in the corner. That said, it's very important for records managers to develop a plan around business continuity to ensure that organizations can start up on the day after a disaster strikes to deliver its core and sort of most essential functions. That being its obligations to itself, its employees, and its consumer and its customers. A vital records plan or essential records plan is not too different from a typical retention schedule, in that it involves communicating with, reaching out to these senior administrators to get a sense of what needs to be retained and why. Also identifying these essential records and including procedures for storing, maintaining, or in some cases even reconstructing essential records in the event of a disaster. To develop a vital records plan, one usually begins by doing a business impact analysis, typically with senior administration, to determine what records are actually irreplaceable and what records are necessary for business continuity. And then they do a very deep, granular dive into where these records are held, who holds them, what the particular circumstances and nature of them are. If they're electronic, are they in a database, and if so, is that database dutifully secured and backed up? If they're physical records, are they stored in a controlled access environment? Is there a vault, for instance, in which these things are held? Are there multiple copies of some of these records made, some of which are held by the organization, and in some cases, particularly around things like patent filings and property records, are duplicates held by other bodies, municipal bodies in some cases. For instance, at Simmons, our documents of incorporation we have a copy of them at the university, and another copy is held at the State House in Boston, Massachusetts. So once you've got a sense of where these are, how they exist, what form they exist in, and what their particular relevance is, you then have to determine who is actually responsible for their maintenance and their reconstruction or repatriation, I guess, on disaster day +1. Oh, here comes my cat. Hey, Mapes. Doing something. So it's very important to conduct a vital records inventory, determining the heightened legal, fiscal, and operational values, as well as the emergency values. If there are emergency contingency plans in place, how do you, what records help support kind of those operational aspects of things? There's backups and servers and remote sites for electronic records. Also, it's very important to be mindful of what steps have been taken in terms of duplication, dispersal, and or digitization of these materials. So I hope this makes fairly clear sense. The textbook gives a fairly strong definition of these things as well. One aspect that is important, I think, for anyone who works in an archives to be mindful of is kind of the Venn diagram that exists between essential records and archival records. Long story short, some essential records are also archival records with historical long-standing relevance, and some are not. Likewise, some archival records have both historical value as well as sort of essential values. These are, the distinction between these is far from clear necessarily, particularly when one approaches things through an archivist's mindset of what documents the history of an organization. You have to kind of put on much more of a business continuity hat in these regards, as opposed to sort of what do people need to know in 100 years. You'd want to know what do people need to know in 1 or 2 days. Let's see, where was I? Sorry, the cat is distracting me. So I think, for instance, Board of Trustee minutes are something that we have at the University Archives, which are both have high historical value, but don't necessarily have immediate operational value. So those would fall into the archival but not essential records category. Other kinds of materials, such as tax filings, employee contracts, and benefits records, those are essential but not archival. The very narrow sliver tends to be around issues of physical assets and those kind of very fixed and physical assets, land holdings, copyrights, things like that. Those are important both historically as well as in a disaster preparedness. And I believe many of you have taken courses in preservation management, which deal much more closely with disaster recovery steps, the risk assessment that one needs to go through in determining both the likelihood and the severity of a disaster, and how those sort of align, and kind of the calculations a records manager or an archivist or any individual, in fact, has to do in weighting those factors. For instance, if something is highly unlikely to happen but has extremely disastrous impacts, that would be considered differently than something that is very likely to happen but has a much lower impact. And that's just a case of that's just a sort of a risk assessment that professionals in the information sciences and in all aspects, stop it, cat, need to do. So I hope this has been somewhat illuminating for you. Again, I encourage you to give a read to the chapter. Drop in on Monday afternoon, and we can discuss this more, or we can just talk about your case studies and check in. Otherwise, feel free to drop me an email, shoot me a line in any way you want to, you feel comfortable with, and just check in. I hope everyone is doing as well as they can under these circumstances. All right, I'm going to sign off now. Say bye, Maple. Say bye. I know. All right, I hope everyone is doing well, and like I said, be in touch, and I'll see you synchronously Monday afternoon. Thank you much.